I was invited. I hope this is interesting to everybody. So as Nick said, I'm recently a new grad student. I just started in January, essentially, and I'm working with vegetable crops. So this is really fun for me. And this plant biostimulant stuff, I think, is been around for a bit and people kind of know about it, but I also think like it's sort of the new big thing that people are trying to figure out and are researching. So I'm interested to share some of the stuff that I've found out through this. So starting off with what is a plant biostimulant, I think a really good definition is right here. It would be any substance or microorganism applied to plants with the aim to enhance nutrient efficiency, abiotic stress tolerance, and or crop quality traits, regardless of its nutrient content. So this is not like a fertilizer, although something called a biofertilizer does fall into this category. But it's essentially things we're adding that are adding some additional fitness to the plant outside of sort of its normal functioning. And here I have some different classes of them. So we have bacteria that can be applied. You have fungi, and we'll talk about these in more depth coming up. We have what's called humic products. So that could be humic acid, fulvic acid, or humans. Inorganic compounds, that would be something like silica. So that would be a nutrient that isn't required by the plant, but it can be helpful for dealing with stress. I've seen silica or cobalt or some of those random things like that you can add as a stimulant. These ones down here are a little heavy, chitosan. A lot of fungi are surrounded by chitin as their sort of cell wall. So by adding chitosan, from what I understand, it kind of ramps up the plant's defense mechanism so that if a fungi is trying to attack it, it can kind of deal with it. But I'm not a biochemist or a microbiologist, so some of this stuff is a little busy, and I'm not using all of it. So seaweed extracts are a really cool one. I think they're one of the bigger ones that people use. I know a lot of organics use like seaweed extract for fertilizer. And they have some pretty interesting things going on with them. And then these protein hydrolysates and other nitrogen containing compounds. So that's pretty much you take protein from other industries and they run it through like enzymes that breaks it down into smaller, either small amino acid chains or amino acids, and then those are supposed to help the plant in a lot of different ways. But I'm only working with bacteria and fungi, a little bit with humics and a little bit with seaweeds. So those are the things that I'll talk about most of that I know about. So I've got this picture here that I think is pretty interesting. Oh, I'm sorry. Because it shows you a bit of the root zone of the plant. So if you can see my mouse, we see here the plant root, and we see the root tip here. And then we've got a scale here of just millimeters from side to side on the horizontal axis. And then we've got a few centimeters of depth. And you can see that out in essentially the bulk soil, right, you have this high microbial diversity. There's a lot of microbes out in soil just living their lives. But as we get closer and closer to the root, we have a higher density of microbes, but we have less diversity. So there are more microbes total, but there are less different types, different species of microbes. And that's kind of interesting because it shows that as time has gone on, that different microorganisms have learned to associate with plants, and we can use that to our benefit, essentially is what these biostimulants tell us. So we can see here that bacteria, we have some of these that show that inside the cell, there are bacteria that can be living there. That's what we would call an endophyte. And then we have here on this rhizoplane, so this is right on the root surface, there are bacteria that live there as well. And then we have this rhizosphere, so that's defined differently sometimes by different researchers, but about these 3 millimeter marks. So that's a pretty small area, but that's what would be considered the rhizosphere, the influence area of a root. So I just wanted to give you that to show you that, there's a lot happening inside, on the root, and outside. that there's even more happening in the bulk soil that's around the plant that's not even necessarily close to it, and that there are a lot of different things. So these bacteria that we could add to the soil are called plant growth promoting rhizobacteria. So if we break that down, like we said, we're trying to get plants here, we're trying to produce vegetables. So it's promoting the growth of plants. And then rhizo in Latin is talking about roots, and bacteria just means that the bacteria lives by plant roots. So PGPR is how you would see this fairly often. When I look up the reason that bacteria are helpful, there's a lot of different ones, different species do different things, but overall, there are some that are living free in the soil that fix nitrogen. So they help that nitrogen gas in the atmosphere move down into a soil system and be usable by plant roots. They help with phosphorus being soluble. A problem we have sometimes here in our arid land soils is that phosphorus will fall out of solution and become immobile, and plants can't get to it even though it's there. And so some microbes can help that get in where a plant can get at it. Something called a siderophore, that's something that helps with iron, that helps chelating iron and getting it into plants. And then there's some really interesting things where plants are excreting hormones that the plant reacts to, and they can actually sort of change the way that a plant root grows just based on their presence in a soil. So it's been shown on some things that if you have these bacteria in the soil, that a plant will tend to have more branching roots and essentially more feeder roots, which is what could help a plant get more water, get more nutrients, be more drought tolerant, and things like that. So that's bacteria, and that's how they can possibly be helpful. Then we have fungi. So fungi are kind of cool because here we see here, if you can see my mouse, this purple one here, it says AMF. So that stands for arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So this mycorrhizae just means myco is talking about fungi or mushrooms in Latin. Rhizae again means root, and endo or ecto is just referring to whether it's inside or outside of the root cell. So you'll see endomycorrhizae or arbuscular mycorrhizae. That just means that we see here that the fungal hyphae, that's the growths of the fungi, they just penetrate into the actual cell, and they take some of them over and create some things, but they're pretty interesting. Endomycorrhizae have associations with about 80% of plant species. So they're in soils, they're making associations, but adding some to crops, especially in areas with pretty high production rates and turnover, could help to establish them and help your crops. So they're pretty cool. An interesting thing about these endomycorrhizae is that they are obligates. So what that means is they essentially have to be living in the root to be alive. So they're not living free in the soil. They pretty much have to be on a root. We can't like grow them in culture or do things like that to them because of that. And then we have this sort of smaller family. These are really interesting for like forest ecology, these ectomycorrhizae. They grow a little bit differently, and they have a lot of associations with like pine trees and things like that. I'm not sure that I've seen them being so useful in agricultural settings, but I'm not here to say yes or no on that. But an interesting fact is that even if they're not creating this association, because they only have association with 3% of plant species, that they can be living free as just fungi in the soil, and they could still be helping with nutrient breakdown and cycling and things like that. So bacteria and fungi are two types of biostimulants. They're pretty interesting. You can apply them in some different ways. They sometimes come in like a powder that you apply to the soil and till in. They could come in something that's already soluble that you could spray on the plant or on the soil, that you could inject through drip irrigation. So they're pretty interesting and pretty cool. And next, I wanted to talk a little bit about, let's see, the other two that I'm working with a little bit. So humic substances. I feel like the word humic acid is kind of thrown around a lot. A lot of people are very interested in that. And there's been some studies showing that it can be be helpful. There's some studies showing that it doesn't do anything. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And I wanted to show you this flow chart that I put over here, because I learned in a class what humic acid is, what fulvic acid is, and how we actually get it. And it's kind of interesting. So it's derived from soils, compost, or there's mineral deposits of essentially carbon stacked on top of each other and then pressured, and they'll go and mine that and pull it out, and then they run it through a process where essentially you take it and you put a super basic pH thing around it, and then the things that fall out of solution are called humin. So those are organic matter particles essentially that are just not soluble in high basic stuff. And that's an application that you could use in soils. They kind of just act as extra organic matter you throw in. And then what they do is they treat that with an acid, a pretty, strong acid. And you get humic acid that precipitates out and becomes kind of a solid. It's not soluble. And then you have what's called fulvic acid. So then they go through some different steps to process that. But at the end of it, you have these 3 different products that are under the umbrella of humic substances. So like I said, this is one I work with just a little bit. I don't know a ton about. Something interesting about all organic matter, right, is that it's helpful for soils. It's helpful for holding on to nutrients, holding on to water, helping with good structure. And so adding these things to your soil where you don't already have a good organic matter, or you don't have maybe enough clay in your soil to hold on to that stuff, could be a really good application, I think, from what I've seen. And then seaweed extracts. So seaweed's kind of cool because farmers have been using seaweed for a really long time, I guess, off the coasts of different continents in Europe or Africa. They've been harvesting it and chopping it up and throwing it on fields as, fertilizer essentially for quite some time. So I think we've refined the process a bit. What I read is they kind of put it through a machine that bursts the cells all, so the contents strip out, and then that's the extract that they sell to you in a bottle. And they have some interesting properties. Some of it is just nutritive, like they have obviously, nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium in them as algae. And those things can be helpful to plants, but there's also these bioactive compounds. So things, like I said, with the bacteria, these hormones that they have that plants respond to, and it can help them either deal with stress or grow a little bit better, or a lot of stuff. I've just been reading papers on how they work, and I think they're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on, but they're a pretty big part of the industry, a pretty big part of biostimulants in general. So they're a pretty big player, and they're pretty cool. So that was kind of a lot. I hope I tried to keep that a little bit, applicable. And I wanted to sit back and say, what does all that mean? And I think for me, for a lot of, I guess I'd call you backyard gardeners, small gardeners, market gardeners, small farmers, things like that. What does it mean? And I think it's interesting to understand the mechanisms of these products, because I think they come back to, in some cases, soil health. So if we're keeping our soils healthy, we have a lot of those things natively in soils. There are bacteria that are living, there are fungi that are already there. And a lot of those, organic compounds that break down can fill a lot of the roles that these, things that we ship in or buy in, they can do a lot of that. But with that said, I think, it's interesting maybe to play around with if you're interested. But soil health and soil microbes, are a really cool thing. And I think that's why this integrated pest management approach is just great, because, rather than just going out and seeing a pest and killing it, we figure out what it is. We use a bunch of different practices to try to control things. And then we use pesticides, herbicides, insecticides when absolutely necessary. And in that way, we can keep, native bugs or bugs that are helpful or positive microbes. We can keep all of that around. I think for home use, I just wanted to touch on that, and this kind of goes with fertilizer, but I've been seeing a lot more fertilizers, especially the organic ones, that have a lot of these same species that I'm working with, that are concentrated for field application. They're already in a lot of these fertilizers. So if you turn to the back of some of these ones that have, maybe biostimulants on the front, or it says that they have microbes, you'll see a lot of the same things. It's bacillus species, it's, different species of fungi. It's, so if you're interested in them in a small way, that could be a way to get started, is just seeing if that's helping your production, adding some of those fertilizers that have them in them, and then maybe taking it the next step and applying them solely. And I think it's important to track your costs, see how much you're paying for these products, and then see if there's any real growth in yield. Because, we want to use stuff that's really going to give us some sort of output, and we want to grow better plants and get better yields. And I just think it's good to keep a look at those things, because they certainly work. There's plenty of evidence that they work, but because we don't understand all the mechanisms all the time, there are times where it breaks down. You can see in some studies that they work really well in greenhouses, certain biostimulants. And then when you apply them to a field, right, there's native microbes, there's a lot going on. There's not as much of an effect. And there's other times where, in the field, they're great. They help plants scavenge for more nutrients. They help them get where they need to go. So I just think it's always good to be cognizant of what to look for. Is my plant doing better? Is it dealing with stress, in a different way than other stuff? Maybe put it on half your field and then not on another half. I think it's fun to play with and try to see what the real effects are. So with that sort of as the backdrop, right? Because biostimulants are maybe kind of a deep topic. I wanted to get into watermelon production and maybe kind of throw in some ways in which these biostimulants would help. Watermelon happens to be the species that I'm working with for my master's research. And these biostimulants come to me in products that I sort of apply. And I've been trying to understand the mechanisms so I can maybe, like I said, kind of look at things and know what to look for better. But in the end, I'm producing watermelon and I'm trying to get good fruit. So I just wanted to talk about some general watermelon production. It's kind of a cool crop in Utah. There's a couple of different areas in like the Weaver River area, over in Green River, down in the Virgin River area, South Utah, where people are producing watermelon commercially. And it seems like there's kind of a cool following of these different areas that have watermelon, that people really like them. And I think a homegrown watermelon tastes better. People want this, fresh produce. And this could be a good thing if you're just wanting to eat them for home use, but also if you're producing and selling, I think a homegrown watermelon can be pretty competitive. So I wanted to show you some fun things about watermelons. It's always important at the beginning to look at varieties. I put the days to maturity next to each of these cultivars, just because up here in Cache County, it's pretty cool, and we want to try to get something, before it gets cold. And in other areas, you might have the luxury of having the longer day stuff and the bigger fruit, and that's just fine. Maybe you're strapped for space and you can only do so much. So I just wanted to present these. This Black Diamond is this one with this really dark green. I think people like the look of that. I think they're kind of trendy. I think they have a really good flavor, the ones that I've had. They're a 90-day. Crimson Sweet is sort of this one right here. I feel like most gardeners have heard of Crimson Sweet. A lot of producers are producing that kind. It's kind of an old classic. There's some of these new fun ones like this Yellow Doll or other sort of, these small, different colored watermelons. So this Yellow Doll would be this one here. That's a 70-day kind of smaller 2-person watermelon that's really nice. Mini Love is just a variety I found. That's this, again, a personal sized one that's a red. And then I've still never tried one of these, but Tender Sweet is this orange colored one. And I think for backyard gardeners, it's fun to produce, cool niche stuff that is fun. And even for producers, that's something to draw people in. Some of the smaller ones that are the 70 days are, 5 to 10 pounds on a fruit. And then you can get some pretty big fruit with the other longer season ones. And it's really about thinking about your production system and what you need from it. And then planting that. For establishing watermelon, you want to think about whether you're getting seeded or seedless. Something interesting about seedless watermelons, I think a lot of the market wants that. People don't want to deal with seeds, but seedless plants can be a little bit difficult. They don't germinate nearly as consistently as the seeded ones. And so they're often transplanted. So just thinking about your your variety and what you want. You definitely want to make sure that your soils are at 65 degrees if you're seeding outside, if you're direct sowing. And even if you're going to do them inside, you probably want a heat bench to keep them up in the 70s. When I do it in the greenhouse, I put them up at 80, 85 because they really like the heat. You put them about 1 to 2 inches deep. When you direct seed, you have to grow a little bit more of the plant before you get a fruit on it. So they might take a little bit longer. So sometimes transplanting is helpful for earliness if you want earlier, and especially transplanting them into some sort of plastic can be helpful. That's how we tend to do it, and a lot of growers tend to do it. The spacing, when I read online, there's a lot of different spacing. It seems like in Utah, people tend to do 2 feet per plant. So 2 feet in between transplants, and then 4 to 6 feet in between the rows. And that seems to work pretty well. That's how we have it at our field. And then I just wanted to talk quickly about, fertility management. And this is an interesting area with the biostimulants. For my research, we're actually doing less fertility on a section of the field to see if the biostimulants are helping them get that anyways and increasing their yield. So it could be a pretty interesting thing of being able to cut back on fertilizer use, applying a biostimulant and getting the same yield. There have been some reports of that. So generally for watermelon, you want to, so let's say you've transplanted, or let's say you've direct sowed. When that plant comes up and it starts to kind of fill out and tip over, usually at about that part is when it starts to vine out that you want to start adding more nitrogen. At the beginning, it doesn't need a whole lot of nutrients, but as it goes and starts to really grow, you want to sort of ramp up your application as it's ramping up its growth, especially as it's flowering, especially as it's setting fruit and growing some of the fruit. You really want to make sure you take care of it really well during those times and give it adequate nutrients. Your phosphorus and potassium, your P and K, you can apply those earlier on because they're not going to leave or be used as quickly. The nitrogen, you really want to spread out over the whole growing season. And then you also want to kind of pull back on some of your fertility as the vines start to maybe die back a little bit, as the fruit's about ready to harvest, and keep an eye on that. So for irrigation, watermelon's kind of a cool plant because it's fairly deep rooted for a vegetable. It can have roots down to about 3 feet. I've got a water sensor in the ground that's 30 inches deep, so almost 3 feet. And, it's just pulling water out of that like crazy because the roots are down there trying to get water. So they're a pretty fun plant. You can direct sow them, and they tend to have a deeper taproot that'll go a little bit deeper than a transplant. So that might be a thought you have if you're wanting to save on some water. And that's another interesting thing with the biostimulants, that they can, especially the mycorrhizal fungi, that they can get into areas of the soil where the plant roots maybe can't, and it can help it get access to water. And then something like the bacteria can maybe help it deal with stress more, or maybe the seaweed extracts can help the plant when it's feeling drought stressed to respond to that better and not, kick your yields down so low. So biostimulants can be interesting in the fertility and irrigation realms for sure. Typically, you try to irrigate fairly deeply. You want to put a lot of water on at once and then give it time to dry out. So 1 to 2 inches per week is pretty standard, because the roots can go down and have a lot of profile to pull out of. And if you're giving a lot of frequent irrigations, which I think home gardeners maybe tend to do more, is water every day, root rots can be an issue. When you have a lot of water kind of logging the soil up, you have some of those pathogens that can get at the plant, and it's a little better to keep an eye on that. And then it's good to pick a style. Drip is how I've always grown watermelon. I really like it. It puts it right there where it needs it. It can irrigate it for a while without having to deal with it and get down deep. But drip isn't always the easiest for people. I know, especially people with secondary water quality that's not great. It's really hard to get it through a drip tube. So sprinklers can be good too. Furrows, even though it's not maybe the most water efficient, can be a pretty good method. A lot of commercial growers use furrow irrigation still to irrigate their plants. Sprinklers, look out for foliar diseases anytime you're getting the leaves wet pretty consistently. Even though we're in Utah and they dry out, you can have powdery mildews or things that might come up. And then again, with irrigation, sort of like the nutrients, as the watermelon's really starting to fill out and get big. If you pull back a little bit on the water, still give it enough to be fine, but pull back a little bit, you'll actually concentrate some of those sugars and it can lead to some better flavors and sweetness. So I just wanted to show you some pictures that I've got from my research that I think are kind of fun that you can kind of see. I planted it, and then this is a week or two later when it kind of tips over and starts to vine out, and you can see it kind of starting out as first vine. It starts throwing on some secondaries. It starts to really bush out, and then it just fills in the whole space. So the cool thing about watermelon is if you're weeding them fairly good at the beginning, they'll fill in that canopy, and then typically you're not going to have annuals that are sprouting up or anything because they're covered up. So dealing with vines could be difficult. I think sometimes home growers or smaller growers don't want to grow watermelons because they take up a lot of space. But I had a picture later on that I wanted to show you. Maybe it was back. Let me go back. So this here on the left is my field. And I have to keep it by plots and separated. And even though this is a big vining plant, if you kind of kick the tips in and you kind of train them a little bit as you go, just, every time you walk through the field, just try to kick them in. They'll grow into a nice kind of uniform area and they'll fill in the space better. So I just wanted to give that suggestion to people that might be space limited and are worried about growing a watermelon, that you can kind of train it to keep into a smaller space and it can handle that. So sorry to go back there. Hopefully that's fine. So there's some growth. I wanted to just show quickly some pests and diseases. I think watermelons are cool because we've had grasshoppers in the field like crazy and they don't really tend to feed on it. I don't know why they don't like it, but we haven't seen a whole lot of damage. Like I said, a lot of these, so this damping off, the Pythium, the Rhizoctonia, the Fusarium, a lot of that comes from water management. If you're watering too frequently, you're going to see a lot of that. These root rots, some of these fruit rots, again, if you're keeping the soil really wet and the fruit's on it, you're going to have troubles. Some of these ones like gummy stem blights are, not really in Utah, but they can be pretty bad. Mildews, again, if you're keeping your foliage wet, you could see that. And certainly as the crown of the plant starts to kind of die back as fruit matures, you'll see a little bit of that take over. But generally your healthy new stuff is fine. Watermelon mosaic virus is another one. Sometimes those viruses are passed on by aphids and those can be problematic. And as far as insect pests, you've got this cucumber beetle down here that could be problematic. Melon aphid, again, aphids are transmitting diseases and can be difficult. And then, you could have some fruit flies and things like that. I just wanted to give a quick little harvest tip. A lot of people have their different picking a watermelon from the supermarket store tricks, and the harvest stuff. But this is what I've tended to hear as, the kind of fail safe. So you harvest it when the tendril is dry, and I'll show you that in some pictures. When the ground spot is yellow and the skin has kind of golden color. So right here we see the tendril. I just took these this morning as I was harvesting. So here on the left, we see this tendril that's coming out right where the fruit connects to the vine. You've got a dieback here of this little leaf that happens to be right there. And then you've got this tendril, and it'll be nice and green and springy and great when it's growing, and then it'll start to die back. So right about here, at about the halfway point, some people might harvest, especially commercial producers will harvest it there. But in your home garden, this is kind of the cool thing, is you can let it die back all the way to the base right there, and then you can cut it, and you've got a couple more days of it throwing sugar into the plant, right? So I think you get a better quality, you get some more sweetness if you do it. And then sometimes you can look at the ground spot. It'll be kind of white when you flip it over, and then as it gets more ripe, it'll sort of yellow. And so that could be a good way in the grocery store to see if it's ripe or not. And then just talking about, again, quality and some of the benefits of eating watermelon. Sugar content is definitely one of the biggest flavor components that it has. There's some other stuff in there, but really high sugar content is what gives it the taste that people like the most. And I always think like, oh, watermelon, it's not a vegetable as most people would consider it. It's kind of eaten as a fruit. It's a dessert. It's really sweet. But it does have some minerals in it that are important. It has good vitamin contents. And then because of the red color, it has lycopene, just like a tomato would, which is an antioxidant. So just kind of a plug for fruits are good for you, even though they're sugary. I think they provide a useful part of being healthy. So just here at the end, I wanted to make a little plug. This article here, Vegetable Irrigation Melon, is how I've been doing a lot of my irrigation. It's, I think, geared towards producers, but you can check on USU websites to see how much water your crops are typically using, and then you can irrigate based on that. So if you're trying to get into precision or like lower water use, I think that's a really cool way to start trying to figure it out. And I could do it in an Excel file. I think it's something it's pretty doable. And then Dr. Dan Drost has written a paper just about watermelon in the garden. Anytime I want to grow a vegetable, I usually check his papers. They have some good insight. And then I have this article right here, which has been one of the biggest reviews for biostimulants in general that I've been using. So if someone's more interested in that area of it, that could be a good thing to look into. It's a little, it's a scientific paper, so I've had to read it multiple times. It's a little dense, but it can be kind of cool. And it's cool to see that this is sort of emerging. He's, talking about getting a definition, a working definition, and making sure we know what it is. And it's kind of cool. So I wanted to end with some of those that if people are interested in some more info, you could go check those. USU's got a lot of stuff. There's a lot of scientific papers coming out about this and et cetera. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that was interesting or educational. And I think now it's